Chapter 5, Carbohydrates, Screencast 1. Now, this first screencast for Chapter 5 is going to be an overall introduction to carbohydrates. The remaining screencast will go into a lot more detail with regards to absorption, digestion, and pretty much everything else related to carbohydrate. So keep in mind, this is a general introduction. Now, I want us to get a feel for this particular slide, because you're going to see this again. Each one of our essential nutrients is going to start off with what are sources of the particular nutrient. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind here is the frame of reference that our textbook is using is MyPlate. And we can see that here. So on the bottom are various food items. And notice they're kind of related to the key here based on MyPlate. Now there is an other, okay, so that other category is not typically included, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And on the y-axis, we're really looking at percent calories, from carbohydrates. And if we look at these here, it's all carbohydrate, okay? Unsurprisingly, when we look at fruits, vegetables, they're also going to be primarily good sources and made up of carbohydrates. Now, there'll be some other things involved, but I want to put the emphasis on this four. So if we look at what they are, soft drinks, honey, syrup, sugar, okay? Pretty much empty calories. And notice that everything, all the calories from these four items in particular are coming from carbohydrate calories. Then as we go through, we're going to see fruits, vegetables, grains, pastas, and other food items. And we're going to see a progressive decrease in the percentage of calories from carbohydrates. But this is something that you should be comfortable interpreting because we're going to see this pretty regularly, and it's a tool that our textbook uses. Now, the first thing that we have to look at is the underlying structure of carbohydrates. And this is something that's shared by all carbohydrates. So starch, fiber, sugar, they're all composed of three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, another important thing to keep in mind here is they are polar in nature. So once again, we're looking at things that are water soluble, not lipid soluble. So all of these are going to require some assistance in how they move out of the cell because they're not lipid soluble. Now, when we look at the primary source of carbohydrates, it's plants. Okay? Now, what plants end up doing, they produce glucose through photosynthesis. So generally what we look at, the plant is going to use carbon dioxide and water in the presence of light. And then we're going to see a product of that, which will be glucose and oxygen. Okay? So once again, all plants basically operate in this particular manner. And this is how the carbohydrate we find in plant items is actually produced. It's all about photosynthesis. Now, when we look at carbohydrates, we're going to break them down in a couple of ways. All right. We have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Now, for the most part, this course is putting the emphasis on 6-carbon sugars, and we can see that as monosaccharides. So C6H12O6. Disaccharides, these are double sugars. Monosaccharides and disaccharides together make up a category of sugars that we refer to as simple sugars. And polysaccharides are going to be complex. So some simple definitions to keep in mind. So let's take a first look at monosaccharides. These are the big three: glucose, fructose, and galactose. And they basically all have the same chemical structure, C6H12O6. It's just arranged differently. Now, glucose is the most abundant of all of the monosaccharides. And generally, we're going to see that as a polymer. Okay? So glucose will combine with another monosaccharide to form a disaccharide, or we're going to see glucose polymers connected in certain ways. Okay? When we hear the term blood sugar, we're really talking about blood glucose, and we're talking about something that the body regulates very tightly. Fructose, that is the 6-carbon sugar that's found in fruits, vegetables, honey, also unsurprisingly high fructose corn syrup. And then we have galactose. Most of the galactose in our diet is combined with glucose in the form of lactose, which is a disaccharide that's found in dairy products. Now, pentoses are also monosaccharides. We are not going to put a large emphasis on those because these are monosaccharides that are pretty much exclusive to genetic material. So ribose is the 5-carbon sugar that you're going to find in RNA. Deoxyribose is the 5-carbon sugar that you're going to find in DNA. So unless I say otherwise, when I talk about carbohydrates, simple or disaccharide, specific to 6-carbon sugars. Okay. Also, we have sugar alcohols, and these are derived from monosaccharides. And the ones that you're commonly going to see are sorbitol, mannitol, and xylitol. Notice they all end with OL. Now, these are items that are used to sweeten sugarless gums and diabetic foods. Now, disaccharides are two monosaccharides linked together. This occurs through a condensation reaction, and generally water is formed when the carbon to oxygen to carbon bond is created. Now, these bonds exist in two different types. We have alpha and beta. Now, alpha bonds are going to be found in maltose and sucrose, and beta bonds are going to be found in lactose. We'll talk a little bit more about these beta bonds. But let's kind of take a look at maltose. Maltose is 2 glucose molecules combined together. Sucrose, or table sugar, that's glucose and fructose. And then we have lactose, which is glucose and galactose. So once again, you want to be comfortable with the big 3 monosaccharides, the big 3 disaccharides, and the monosaccharides that make them up. Now, beta bonds are bonds that are not easily broken down. So foods that contain this type of a bond, they're either difficult or impossible to digest. So we'll talk a little bit how that process takes place a little bit later. Now we have oligosaccharides. Now these are complex carbohydrates. They're not polysaccharides, so they're generally made up of 3 to 10 sugar units. If we look at raffinose and stachyose, examples of those are going to be onions, cabbage, whole wheat, legumes, broccoli. Here, the bond between the sugar units are beta bonds. Now, beta bonds basically mean that we can't break them down. So these food items actually pass into the large intestine without being digested. So they're going to be broken down by bacteria in the large intestine, and part of the byproducts is going to be intestinal gas. Now, some individuals do not tolerate these food substances very well, and they may take what's known as BINO. BINO is an enzymatic preparation, and what it does, it helps break down those beta bonds. And so it makes it easier to digest these particular food items. Now, the next type of polysaccharides that we're going to talk about are digestible. Now, starch, which comes from plants, and there's 2 different types of starches. We have amylose and amylopectin. What makes these different is the actual degree of branching that we see in these polysaccharides. Amylose is unbranched, and amylopectin is actually highly branched. Now, when we see something that's highly branched, what that actually allows for are more sites for enzymes to actually work. So because there's more enzyme action, these with amylopectins can be broken down fairly easily, and they're going to result in a fairly rapid increase in blood glucose levels. Okay. Now, if we look at some examples of commonly consumed starches, we're going to look at potatoes, beans, breads, pasta, rice, and generally what's characteristic of these are alpha bonds. Now, glycogen. Now, this is the storage form of carbohydrate in humans and animals. Together, these glucose molecules are linked by alpha bonds, and these are extremely highly branched. And we are going to find glycogen primarily in two places, the liver and muscle cells. Now, the liver can basically take glycogen and convert it into blood glucose, and our muscles can use this glucose to generate ATP during exercise. Now, here we can actually see the three different types of digestible polysaccharides. We see amylose, and notice not branched at all, amylopectin, branched, and then look at glycogen, okay, highly branched molecule, which basically means we can break that down and get access to glucose pretty readily. But keep in mind, we have limited capacity to store glycogen. Now, the other types of polysaccharides are indigestible. Fiber is really what we're focusing on here. We can look at two types of fiber, dietary fiber, and that's fiber that's found naturally in food items. And then there's also functional fiber, fiber that has actually been added to foods. Now, when you are looking at the food panel, that food panel only indicates dietary fiber. So functional fiber or fiber that has been added is not included on that label. So when you see the following, okay, cellulose, hemicellulose, pectins, gums, these are all together linked by beta bonds. So remember, we cannot digest them. We lack the enzymes to break down beta bonds. So they move into the large intestine pretty much undigested, and they're going to be broken down by bacteria, generally through anaerobic processes. So the product, typically when these are broken down, are going to be short-chain fatty acids and gas. Now, fiber comes in two types. We have insoluble and soluble. Insoluble fiber is that fiber that does not dissolve in water, and typically we're looking at the structural part of a plant. So seeds, whole grains. Here, if we look at an apple, the peel is made up of insoluble fiber. Then there's soluble fiber. This is fiber that's actually dissolved in water, and it's found inside and around plant cells. So pectins, gums, these are some examples. I want to put the focus on oat bran, fruits, legumes, and psyllium. So this is soluble fiber. So you should be able to provide examples of insoluble versus soluble overall. Now here on the top panel, we're actually looking at soluble fiber and some common examples. Now they're showing strawberries here, but note what they're talking about. They're talking about the thickener in jams and jellies, the pectin. Okay, if we look at oat bran, if we look at legumes, okay, so these are some really good examples of soluble fiber. And one thing that I want you to be comfortable with, what are the physiological effects that are actually associated with these? So one of the things that we will see as a result of of soluble fiber, and why we should be consuming is, one, it helps lower blood levels of cholesterol. So that's one. The other thing, it's going to minimize or decrease blood glucose levels. So a diabetic in particular should be consuming soluble fiber. Now, insoluble fiber, now here we're looking at whole grains, the seeds of fruit, and the physiological effects of insoluble fiber are decreasing transit time through the intestine, so regularity, things move through them more quickly. And also, insoluble fiber is known to decrease the risk for diverticular disease, and that is specific, a condition that we may find in the large intestine. Now, when we're talking about carbohydrates in foods, starch accounts for the majority of carbohydrate in our diet. So plant-based foods, grains, legumes, potatoes, those are all good examples of where we get starch. Now, a lot of foods that contain starch also contain fiber. Okay? Now, one thing to keep in mind, grains that are highly processed are low in fiber. So soluble fiber, okay, one of the things that we should be doing is eating more fruits and vegetables, And that's where we're going to find soluble fiber. Okay. Now, the next part is talking about different types of sweeteners. We're going to be looking at nutritive sweeteners versus non-nutritive. Nutritive is used the term for energy yielding. So if we're looking at monosaccharides, here in particular we have high fructose corn syrup. And high fructose corn syrup is something that has been villainized. We've seen, if you go out on the internet, you're going to see negative information about high fructose corn syrup. And in response to that, a lot of the companies that produce high fructose corn syrup, you've probably seen the commercials, okay, promoting it. The thing here we want to keep in mind is moderation, okay? Monosaccharides in particular should be consumed in moderation. Most of them are empty calories. Now, high fructose corn syrup is produced through the enzymatic breakdown of cornstarch. And when we look at high fructose corn syrup, it's about 55% fructose. Now, one thing that we're going to look at is comparing the sweetness level to sucrose. So sucrose is that frame of reference. So high fructose corn syrup is very similar in sweetness levels to sucrose. Now, places where you're going to find high fructose corn syrup: soft drinks, candies, jams, desserts, and so on. Now, the other type of monosaccharides that are nutritive or energy yielding in nature are the sugar alcohols. Now, I want to kind of point some time here. We talked about mannitol, xylitol, and so on. I'm going to talk about xylitol in particular. The veterinarian that I go to, on all of the invoices I get, there's a warning at the very bottom about xylitol. Xylitol is very, very toxic to pets. I don't know about cats, I know for dogs, okay? And you have to be very careful and make sure that your dog does not get into xylitol. So sugarless candies, gums, things like that. I have a lab, so he likes to eat things. He's been known to go into my pockets to eat things. So if he were to get into a pocket that had sugarless gum with xylitol, that would be pretty much an emergency situation. Okay. Now, the other thing that we see here that you have to be aware of, a lot of substances, peanut butter that are low in sugar, sugar-free, some of them actually have xylitol in them. So you have to be very careful. I know I use peanut butter to help him or to give medicine to him, and I have to make sure that I am not giving him peanut butter that has xylitol. Now, one of the reasons why we see xylitol and other of the sugar alcohols in sugarless candies and gums is they're not easily metabolized by the bacteria in our mouth. Excuse me. So these do not promote dental caries. Now, there is energy associated with them, but they are absorbed and metabolized relatively slowly. Now here, this is a table that's a list of typical sources of nutritive sweeteners and non-nutritive sweeteners, or the term alternative. The next few slides are going to be looking at these non-nutritive sweeteners. But first, excuse me, I want to walk through this diagram. And what we're looking at is relative sweetness, and the frame of reference is sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. And what we have, the first 6 are sugars. The next 3 are sugar alcohols. And then we have alternative or non-nutritive sweeteners. So one thing that I want to point out here, if we look at the majority of our sugars, they're relatively close in sweetness to, excuse me, to sucrose, along with sugar alcohols. They're actually not as sweet. But now, look at the alternative sweeteners. Many of them are significantly higher in sweetness. And one good example about those is if you actually take a look at the next time you're sitting at a diner or you go to a coffee shop, you'll notice sugar packets and other saccharin. You'll notice equal. And I want you to compare the volume of the sugar packet sucrose to equal or sweet and low. And what you'll notice is it's significantly lower in those alternative sweeteners. And the reason why is those alternative sweeteners are significantly greater in sweetness levels than sucrose. So you don't need as much of these alternative sweeteners to provide the same sweetness level that's found in sucrose. Now, when you're looking at a food label, one of the things that you've probably recognized, there's lots of different ways to hide sugar. This is a list of all nutritive sweeteners that are used in foods. That's a lot of different ways to say sugar, and quite often what you might see a food manufacturer do to minimize or make it appear that there's not as much sugar, include these other terms. Because remember, when you look at a food panel, the list is based on what the most of to the least. So if you have sugar in different forms, okay, you're going to see that expressed in the ingredient level and position on the ingredient level. Now, non-nutritive sweeteners, these are alternative sweeteners. The safety of these is determined by the FDA. And usually they're using what's known as an acceptable daily intake. Now, what these measures are the amount of alternative sweeteners considered safe for daily use across one's lifetime. The research on these alternative sweeteners is based on animal studies, but I also want to point these out. The ADI is set at 100 times less, okay, once again, less than the level where no harmful effects were seen. This is important, okay? There's two sweeteners out there in particular where you're going to see some bad information indicating either carcinogenic or some other issues, saccharin and aspartame. Okay, we're going to take a closer look at those as we move through. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire list here. Okay, there are a number of these non-nutritive sweeteners. Saccharin is actually the oldest. Okay, one of the things that I will point out, those that are actually heat stable. So I do want you to know those. Those are actually heat stable. So the two on this page, saccharin and aspartame, are not heat stable. Both of them are the two also where we see a lot of poor information on the internet as far as issues. Now, aspartame, that is the primary non-nutritive sweetener that's found in diet soft drinks, okay, diet foods and things like that. The trade name would be NutraSweet or Equal, okay. Now, the other thing that I want you to be comfortable with is these cannot be used in cooking, all right. Also note they are significantly sweeter than sucrose, saccharin 300 times, and aspartame anywhere from 160 to 220 times. Now, one concern that is legitimate about aspartame, those people that have this condition, PKU, these are individuals that cannot metabolize the amino acid phenylalanine. That is found in aspartame, and that is why you'll see this warning on anything that has aspartame in it, that the individuals that have this disorder have to stay away from aspartame. Now, the characteristic that sets these apart from the other ones that we've looked at is the fact that they're all heat stable. Okay, so all of these can be used in cooking. So neotame, Sanet, Naturalose, Sucralose, that's Splenda. Okay, you can actually go to Wegmans and buy big bags of Splenda, and you can use that in baked goods. So all of these are heat stable and significantly greater in sweetness for the most part than sucrose. Here, these are probably two newer ones that are out there. Stevia, you've probably seen that. That actually is from a plant. So we'll see that overall. And then also you have monk fruit. I'm not going to go with the other name. I can't pronounce that. This is a fruit from Asia. It's also heat stable. Okay. Now there's no ADI set for monk fruit. And what you will see is that abbreviation known as generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. So that is an abbreviation that you should be familiar with. We introduced that in chapter 3.